Well, greetings, folks. Another Tuesday evening. Nice to see so many on already, and we're just getting going. I'll put this free show little label up there for a moment, and we'll just let that run through and get ourselves down to the top of the hour. I like to try and start on time as best I can. Just the dogs, they're here. Been barking at the refuse collectors who've just passed, but they're back quiet now, so hopefully they'll stay put. And here's the studio. No guest, of course, it's just me tonight. So the screen over there on my right is just showing icons, but everything else is set up with the multi-view and the chat and all the other information we're going to use this evening for this show, which I think will be quite an interesting conversation, not least because there is so much to cover. I reckon this show could easily be 4 hours. Don't worry, it's not going to be 4 hours, but there is a lot potentially to talk about tonight. And we're going to try and do a bit of a deep dive on some of the property data, but I'm going to pivot it a little bit to talk about investment property in particular, and also want to talk a little bit about some of the broader news items that have just come out, because there's a hell of a lot to talk about, really, which is good, because it means there's always plenty to share on the show. Anyway, let me take the pre-show off, and I'm going to start the show properly. I'll be back in just a moment as we hit the top of the hour. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 11th of February 2025. Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. And thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. It's just me this evening, and we're going to talk specifically about some of the property-related information. It's quite important to underscore, I think, that there's a lot going on in and around property at the moment, but we need to strip out some of the shenanigans from reality, and that's some of this analysis we're going to do today will help us with that. As always, if you have a specific question or comment for me, if you want to get it in the chat, then use @WalkTheWorld. @WalkTheWorld, then put it in my queue, and then I can see your question, and there's a good chance that I can actually respond. We're not giving specific financial or property advice, of course, as normal. This is just a general conversation. I also don't monitor everything that's going on in the chat, simply because there is so much there. But I do encourage you to put your questions, comments, and a bit of banter in the chat. Always fun. I know people appreciate that. And I guess the final thing to say is that we have enabled Super Chat, that if you'd like to get your question top of the queue, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here, Super Chat's a way to do that. And we really appreciate those who support us, whether it's via Super Chat or via our PayPal, links below, or indeed via our Patreon program. And again, links below on that. The Patreon program includes access to a lot of the data that we're going to talk about tonight. And for those already enrolled in the Patreon at the right tier, we'll be sending out the full data later on this week. Anyway, what we're going to do today is to talk a little bit about some of the analysis. I've called this Feeling the Pain, a deep dive into postcode property data. The reason this is important is because we're at a bit of a turning point, I think, in terms of what's going on with property at the moment. And what I feel from my analysis, and also feel from some of the one-to-one conversations that I've had, is that people are a bit confused about what's going on. So let's delve into some of that. And also perhaps touch on some of the broader issues before we do that, because there is quite a lot to talk about. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the recent things that I've been across, I don't know whether you saw this, but this was quite fascinating. So on Media Watch, the new host talked about a Channel 9 program called Find My Beach House. It's one of those where, you take a couple round and you show them houses and they choose one and then go after it. Except, interestingly, they're now claiming that about half of the contestants already had bought a property, and the property they'd bought was already featured in the show. So effectively what you were seeing by way of, let me think, oh, what a lovely property. That's our own property. And in fact, one set of contestants have now put their property on the market, of course, having received the free publicity from Channel 9. Another one was actually now offering it for Airbnb at presumably an exalted price, because they can say it was on My Beach House. Interestingly, Media Watch said that Channel 9 had taken down the series off now. So I don't know what's going on there. But that's a really good point that I want to start with tonight, that you can't necessarily trust everything you see or indeed read about property. And remember, of course, that Channel 9 has significant connections with the property industry. And so perhaps we should just be a bit skeptical. Now, talking about being skeptical, there was another piece of news that came out over the last 24 hours. And in fact, I watched this live because this morning, Jim Chalmers actually held a press conference talking about regional banking, et cetera, and in fact announced that there is an agreement between Australia Post and the banks. They had a bit of horse trading, I think, overnight with Anna Bligh from the ABA and also the CEO from National Australia Bank, who also chairs the ABA. And this agreement effectively provides a deal to shore up services in the bush by expanding the membership and increasing funding of the banking operations for Australia Post. And the major banks also agreed to a moratorium on regional branch closures until July 2027. And interestingly, ANZ has agreed to join, and Macquarie have begun negotiations, and HSBC have agreed to start talks. And one of the critical things, as well as not closing branches, is to continue to use Australia Post. And so it basically provides more funding and more capacity for Australia Post. Although, in fact, the CEO of Australia Post didn't admit that there would be any significant profit advantage. It would help, but not necessarily make them turn profitable. So it's interesting that according to the Financial Review, an industry source said they believe the government avoided the banking levy. So this is the thing that the government was thinking about, putting a levy on the banking industry to support effectively regional branches, due to the fears the coalition would argue Labor was introducing another tax during the election campaign. But evidently the current approach had some support. But it is interesting. They've done some horse trading here, but I think I'm a bit skeptical. I'm not sure that this is necessarily the full story. Interestingly, Chalmers did say in the press conference they were still having another conversation going on about the future of Australia Post, et cetera. So this is a sort of a small victory, and it wouldn't have happened without all the work we've been doing in terms of regional banking and all of those things, the inquiry, all those things. But just to sort of give you a better context, I did make a show the other day called In the Grips of a Cash Famine by Design. And it is worth just highlighting that, of course, there is this Treasury report that is out now and is open to submissions by the 14th, Valentine's Day. So my argument is that their proposal to make cash available for specific services, but not including small businesses, is a bit of a con, really. But nevertheless, there is an opportunity to have your say with regard to cash and banking and what have you. My belief is that cash is really important. It needs to be protected. And in fact, the banks are playing a bit of a long con, and the government probably too. So anyway, interesting. So make your submission if you haven't done so. Now, with regards specifically to the property market, the media's been a bit sort of all over the place on this. There was this particular article showing that there is actually a lift in property possessions to a 5-year high. Still quite low numbers, 1,632 in New South Wales Supreme Court filings. But there was a bit of a discussion here. And look, there is pressure clearly out there for some people. And my belief is that we're going to see this continuing for some little time. Of course, Angus Taylor, the opposition Treasury spokesperson, really was talking about the astronomical housing pressure, significant increase in interest being paid, etc. The burden faced by Australian households is astronomical, and of course, plugging away at Labor. Labor's economic mismanagement has kept inflation interest rates higher for longer, and it's hardworking Australians left paying the higher prices. All of that is definitely part of the story. So that was quite interesting. There was another article that was talking about renting retirees face falling off a cliff. So this is from the Grattan Institute, highlighting the fact that a lot of people who are now moving into retiree land and have only ever rented are actually very much at a disadvantage. This is something that I've been seeing for some time in my analysis too. And as we'll see later when we look at the more detailed stuff, the problem is that many people, if they don't ever end up owning a property, when they get into retirement with lower incomes, are really struggling. So that's a very important point. And then Alan Kohler was stirring the pot on this as well. So he actually put this show up. Australia's housing crisis is driven by lip service, hypocrisy, and an investment culture. And in fact, he sheeted a lot of the blame for the mismanagement of property over 30 years or so back to Howard's era, which is partly true. It's not the only thing, of course. The deregulation of the financial system, all those things created part of the problem. But that was enough to create an upset at the HIA, the Housing Industry Association. And they said that in this article, in 1999 came the final death knell of housing as a right when it became an investment asset after the Howard government halved capital gains tax. And of course, the HIA claims that this is misleading. Kohler incorrectly concludes that this halving of capital gains tax. The conclusion is wrong. But my belief is that the investment story and the tax relief and all of those things were part of the problem, but it was very much a complex set of issues. Deregulation, reduction of interest rates, of course, over the period as well. Banks lending a lot more, so the income multiples were a lot higher. So it's very difficult to sheet it to one thing. And then, of course, you've also got the supply questions. Will we be building enough in the right places? And all those things are part of it. But it is interesting that Kohler's specifically picked up on the investment story, and that's definitely part of the problem. So interesting angle there. And now with regard to what's ahead, of course, the big question is, will the RBA actually cut the rate in February when they meet next week? May well be. This was, of course, an article from recently talking about the 93% chance the Aussies will see a bit of a move. An 80% chance, said Dr. Oliver at AMP. All four majors now are predicting a cut. Of course, the RBA cut is not yet a done deal. And as I said yesterday on Edwin's rant, of course, whether they cut, there's another question, because the cutting the cash rate doesn't translate necessarily directly to mortgage rate reductions. And there was a CanStar analysis that said that, in fact, the banks didn't pass on all of it when rates were cut in the last cycle. Now, true, everyone is calling, well, not everybody actually, some people are calling, but Gino Bank's chief economist, Warren Hogan, is arguing that that would actually be pretty disastrous because the jobs growth is quite strong, the retail sales was strong, et cetera, et cetera. And so is there a political pressure going on here? And, there are some pros and there are some cons. And the problem I see is that there's a risk that the RBA gets sort of politically pressurized into doing something which may not be very accurate in terms of trying to get that inflation range back into the core range. As I've discussed in an earlier show, of course, the inflation rate, the official rate, is actually lower than the real rate because of all the government handouts. Some of those will stop. The Queensland one for transport is already coming to an end. The question will be whether the government will extend the electricity subsidies further. And if you look at the real rate of inflation, it's probably a little bit higher. Then, of course, you've got the context here also of Trump and tariffs and exchange rate moves, all those things. So complex for the RBA. In my scenarios, and I'll come on to those shortly, I have now included the assumption of a rate cut in February. It's certainly, possible and would have an impact on property prices, but there's also a possibility that it will be delayed. Most of the analysts are talking about 2 or 3 cuts through the course of this year. I do think that there is some potential for cut, but I'm not sure it's as strong as many people are saying. Now, of course, elsewhere, the spruiking goes on with property doubling. Well, property prices doubling in 10 years, maybe, although this particular article suggested that Victoria didn't do quite so well. Or you can buy a beach box for a mere $99,000, only 7.5 square meters. And then, of course, there's the big debate about would you renovate or detonate, makeover for eyesore properties. And, there's a lot of rebuilding and stuff going on. That a junk-laden derelict knockdown was sold for $700,000 to a buyer who will spend hundreds of thousands more cleaning it up as more people choose renovation over detonating in the current market. The point of this about renovations, of course, you need to have a builder that can do it. Cost of materials are rising. And I've worked with a few people through my one-on-ones over the last couple of months. And when you do the maths, you have to be really careful you don't over capitalize, because effectively you can spend more in terms of trying to renovate than the value of the property once you've done it. Interesting also to see that the story here about in moving out Sydney workers who travel hundreds of kilometres each day to be in the office, Newcastle round trip, 5 hours. There are some people doing that. Of course, working at home is still there, although it's being turned away a little bit in some areas. And of course, another little story here is that the land is still very expensive. Sydney blocks are as much as double the price in other states. But also Melbourne blocks are selling at the same price as, in fact, blocks of land, tiny Melbourne blocks of land selling at the same price as houses in the same area, as the city grapples with the bizarre affordability issue that threatens home building goals. And that gets very important. And then, of course, as old Cookie highlights here, and we might just bring that one up. Whoops. What's happened there? Why isn't that showing? Should be showing. Okay, my chat's just broken. I'm not sure why that is. It was working previously. I'll have to sort that out later. Anyway, Cookie made the point that the council taxes were actually potentially a question. Is it 87? I think it's maybe 40% rise for North Sydney Council is now what they've agreed. And as Perrin says, Tony isn't impressed. Absolutely. Mega rate rise. Let's just pay. Rates will cripple businesses, of course, they're saying in North Sydney. And they also had an article here saying the free junketeers, so effectively councils are enjoying overseas conferences at your rates. So that's a problem. Yeah, very interesting. And with all of these things that are going on, the more you sort of scratch your head and think, I don't know, some very interesting things going on there. Now let's see whether we can get this chat to work. Yeah, there we go. Yes, very interesting. And with all of these things, who knows what's going to happen next? But I do find it quite fascinating that people are worrying about the rates. Now, with regards to other costs, there was this little gem, shock move on rubbish dump fees up in Queensland, which of course was quite fascinating. So the Gold Coast is saying residents are going to have to pay more to get rid of rubbish. Another way. And of course, this little gem here, we earn $350,000 a year, but still are battling to save. Yes, a lot of people, more affluent people, are under pressure, as we'll come on to shortly. And of course, six-figure falls in regional house prices. Their prices are dropping down in some areas, although that said, there are also people who are paying a large amount of money to knock down and build a duplex. So it's all over the place, really. And my observation is that the property spruikers in the media are really pushing quite hard. Of course, they're saying things like February floodgates. The rate cuts could spark Sydney property arms race. Maybe, maybe not. Meanwhile, landlords are looking interstate to drive their dollars further. New South Wales landlords in particular are increasing turning to other states like the fringes of Melbourne and Brisbane. And as we'll see later, maybe Perth too. And just as another context, of course, there was an article that said that, maybe it's too late to avoid the costly gas crisis because effectively the LNG question is, really hot now. The idea of importing gas back into Australia, that could incur additional costs not currently experienced by gas users on the East Coast because of the extra shipping, liquefaction, regasification costs. So that's something else to highlight. So, wherever you look, there's a lot of pressure on households, a lot of concerns about the future costs and et cetera, et cetera. And my belief is that even if we do get a couple of interest rate cuts, it's not necessarily going to change the story particularly much. Now, as I sort of go into the data in a bit more detail, it's worth highlighting that consumer confidence is a bit all over the place. It's still relatively low, though it's come up slightly from its lows. The weekly expectation on inflation is still sitting at around 5%, which is interesting. And I also make the point that the aggregates in December, which were published at the end of January, show that credit growth is still pretty strong, particularly for housing. So if you look at the credit aggregate data, you can see there that from a monthly growth perspective, the monthly was 0.4 for owner-occupier and 0.6 for investor housing. And that essentially means that the overall story with regards to housing credit is pretty strong, and other personal credits also growing as well. So it's quite interesting. And if you look at the annual rates, you can see there that credit growth is still pretty strong. So if I was the RBA, I would be looking at this quite seriously. I've always talked about the credit impulse being essentially the critical extra accelerator on home prices. The more that you can borrow, the more that you can throw money at property, the more you can lift prices. And so the credit accelerator here is looking quite strong. So that will be another reason in my mind for the RBA to be a little bit cautious as opposed to driving it. Now, what I want to do next is just begin to touch on some of my analysis specifically from my surveys. And we're going to start by looking at the data to the end of January. This is actually the overall story. And you can see here that the mortgage stress is just slightly down. It was above 50, but it's now just under. The reason this stress has come down slightly is because of all those government support mechanisms, particularly electricity support, school fees, transport, and some of the other things that were going on. The rental assistance has helped the rental stress not go up much higher. It's still sitting around 78 or thereabout. And you can also see the debt to income ratio is coming down very slightly. That's because people are paying down their mortgages. So that's pretty interesting in terms of seeing what's actually going on with regard to the stories. Now, one of the other factors in all of this is where people are getting money from. And I just want to briefly update you with the Bank of Mum and Dad data, because that was another piece of work that we did. And that showed that effectively Bank of Mum and Dad first-time buyers were actually up again, so more than 17,000 over the last quarter. And you can see there that the proportion seeking help from the Bank of Mum and Dad is now 60% of first-time buyers. So it's very high. It's as high as it's been if you look back over the trends for recent years. And the average size across Australia is $112,000, but in Sydney it's more than $200,000 now from parents. Great if you've got parents that actually have that capacity to help. And it's interesting that parents are about 79% of those providing support. Grandparents are now at 12%. And even other family members like siblings at 8.8%. So you can see here it's not really now the Bank of Mum and Dad, it's the family bank. And just to give you a bit of a flavour as to where the Bank of Mum and Dad sits, well, it's the 10th biggest lender. You can see there that you've got the CBA, Westpac, National Australia Bank, ANZ, etc., right? But here is the Bank of Mum and Dad, and the Bank of Mum and Dad's now worth about $40 billion. So if you are fortunate enough to have parents with cash, then you've got a chance to get into the market. If you don't have parents with cash, then there's a much less significant opportunity. Now, I've shown you the high-level stress story, but let me just briefly tell you that, of course, we model this from our surveys, 52,000 at any one time. We slice and dice the data on a regular basis, updated each month. And that information then goes into our core market model. That core market model gives us also some scenarios, and we can talk about those scenarios shortly. And those scenarios then allow us to take the mortgage stress data, the property price and trajectory information, the buying and selling intentions, the migration data, and the CPI and all those things, put it into the core market model. And that gives us a view then as to what may be happening ahead with regard to the best case, the base case, and the worst case scenario. Scenarios, a way of showing sensitivity, is not necessarily, of course, giving you a prediction of where prices may go, because there are so many variables in there. And just to say, of course, if you are interested in having a detailed conversation about a particular suburb, got quite a few people in my queue at the moment, but we are still providing the one-to-one service. What that gives you is a conversation that can look at a particular area, not a specific financial advice piece. I can't give financial advice, but I can use my data to show what's going on, looking at all the information I've got and based on my modeling. And typically there's conversation about an hour via Zoom or phone. There's a cost involved simply because there's a lot of work to do to be able to put it together. And we're booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead at the moment. If you go to the DFA blog, links are below. You can book a time if you'd like to have a conversation with me about a particular suburb. And it's interesting that some of the people that I've got teed up, I've got people, for example, first-time buyers trying to get into the market. I've got people who are trying to work out whether they should upsize. I've got some downsizer conversations going on. And I've also got somebody dealing with effectively a property that's an estate that needs to be disposed of and trying to work out what to do. So people in different states of life looking at some way of helping. Okay, now briefly, before we get into the detail, I just need to just share a little bit more information about stress, because the definition of stress is actually really, really important. And I find a lot of people are confused about the way that I do it. My definition of stress is simply this. We don't use 30% of income. We don't use 30% of taxable income. We don't use underwriting metrics. Those are what other people use. We define stress in cash flow terms, money in, money out. And essentially, if money is out is bigger than money in, if households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items like holidays and income, we define them as stressed. If they have a mortgage, they're in mortgage stress. If they're renting, they're in rental stress. And investors, of course, can have cash flow pressures too. And we identify them as stressed investors. More about that shortly as we look at the detail of stressed investors. And we can look at the data to look at the total financial stress at the postcode level. And we can look at it in percentage terms and counts. I often say the counts are quite useful because it gives you the weight of big numbers. We'll also touch on some of the percentage data, particularly investment areas later. Now, just on the spectrum of household financial stress, this RBA chart shows it quite nicely because I look at it at the mild end. So when people are starting to get budget pressures, when there's more money going out than coming in, that's where they've got a problem. Beyond that, some people then slide down into missing payments, and beyond that, you might go into insolvency. But that journey to insolvency can be perhaps 3 to 5 years sometimes. So some of the highest insolvency in the country at the moment is in Western Australia due to the last downturn that was some years ago. So it takes a long time. And that's why there's a disconnect between the level of stress in the system and absolute defaults and delinquencies. Missing payments, of course, is that sort of medium signal. And remember, the banks at the moment are doing an awful lot to try and support people to be able to help them through and extend and pretend, as I sometimes say, so that effectively we are seeing only the tip of the iceberg. But as I showed you in that earlier article, of course, we are seeing more people having effectively now to default or get foreclosed, and we're probably going to see more of that ahead. Now, just to sort of take the conversation forward, I've shown you the overall trend in terms of the stress data, and just to recap that's what we showed you. So you can see there that things are still quite bad. But the next slide is actually a bit more granular information. This is at December, and this is at January. So we'll look at the January data, and you can see here in yellow where stress has risen from last month. So in the ACT, it's now at 41.3% of households. In the Northern Territory, 43.4%. In Tasmania, it's up at 59.2%. And you can see there in the blue colour in New South Wales, it was down. And in Western Australia, it was down. That is the direct consequence of all the government support, particularly the electricity bill support. You can see there that rental stress was up in New South Wales, Northern Territory, and also in Victoria and Western Australia. And you can see there that stressed investors are also up in Northern Territory, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, and Western Australia. And the overall level of financial stress, which was down overall at 47.4%, which translates overall to more than 4.7 million households, was up in Tasmania, Victoria, and Western Australia, and down in some other states, as you can see there. So that's the current state of play. And just on the numbers, I do talk the rule of big numbers. So in mortgage stress, 1.8 million households. In rental stress, 2.3 million households. And stressed investors, just under 500,000. And you can see there how they're distributed across the states. Of course, the bigger population bases tend to have a bigger number. And that's true across the board. But that's giving you a bit of a flavour. Now, another way of looking at it is also looking at it by segment. And you can see there that the yellow here just shows you the largest. So young growing families, including first-time buyers, the highest proportion in mortgage stress, cash flow stress. And you can see there that there are roughly 286,000 first-time buyers, young growing families in mortgage stress. You can also see that on the rental stress category, you can see there that multicultural establishment, they're the first generation Australians at 87%. But also we've got mature stable families at 84%, wealthy seniors at 82%, and stress seniors at 81%. And this wealthy seniors thing is quite interesting. So even if you do have some assets, you might well be running your own income from super in some form. You may not have enough from your superannuation to be able to cover the rentals. And so we're seeing that pretty high. So that's in line with that research that I shared earlier. And you can actually see rental stress is pretty high across the board. If you look at stressed investors, not surprisingly, it's the exclusive professionals, the people who have the most investment properties per capita, and also the young affluents who actually have the biggest problem. But again, it's across the board, and 16%. And you can see there that the overall financial stress for young growing families at 67% is the highest. But you've also got people on the urban fringe and the battling urban groups, as well as some of those older households too. And I also want to highlight the young affluents. So people with big incomes, and exclusive professional, people with big incomes are also in some difficulty. If we then quickly look at the mortgage stress data, this is the monthly report, and you can see there that Liverpool's still at the top of the list with more than 12,600 households. 91% of the population have cash flow issues. Then we go to Toowoomba, 4350, Campbelltown back in New South Wales, Wanneroo in Western Australia, Narre Warren, Roxburgh Park in Victoria, Camden in New South Wales, Cranbourne in Victoria, Berwick and Harkaway in Victoria, Pakenham in Victoria. These are all high growth corridors, of course. Riverstone in New South Wales, Ballarat, regional area in Victoria, and then Merriwa and Riverside in Tasmania, including, of course, East Launceston. And if we look then at the risk of default, this is the other way of looking at it. So where are the pain points? And looking at the count of defaults, this is over the next 12 months on my modelling. The areas around Cranbourne look to be the most risk areas. But then we've got Western Australian, including Mount Lawley and areas around Mandurah and Success and Armidale. This is because of that overhang from several years ago that is coming back through. Then Roxburgh Park, another Western Australian postcode, Tarnet, Derrimut, Point Cook. And of course, interestingly, that this particular postcode was one where the recent election was actually a problem for the Victorian incumbents. Gosford, of course, Toowoomba, Yatala, Wanneroo, Beckenham, and Bundaberg. So that's the risk of defaults. And that's worth watching because that is going to put downward pressure on prices in some of those areas. If we then look briefly at the rental stress, you can see there that central Melbourne is still at the top of the list, followed then by Toowoomba, then Liverpool, then Westmead, Southport, Campbelltown, Zetland in New South Wales, Tarnet, Derrimut, Bundaberg, Coomera, Mount Druitt, Ipswich, and Yatala. So the same olds in some of those large areas. And you can see there that the number in rental stress are very high, and the proportion is also very high too. We then look at the stressed investors. Western Australian postcodes are having issues at the moment because of the costs of interest rates flowing into a problem with some of the investment properties, but then also places like Lane Cove and Hornsby, and Randwick in New South Wales, Southport and Toowoomba in Queensland, Westmead, Cogra in New South Wales, Victoria and postcode 3000. And that's no surprise given what we said just now about the rental stress, of course. And then Bowona and Mandurah, Little Mountain, DY and Bundaberg there. So you can see there that there's quite a lot of stuff going on. And in some of these areas, stressed investors are pretty high. Now, all this is saying is they've got a cash flow problem. In other words, they're seeing more money out the door than coming in the door. And I want to highlight this because I want to spend a bit of time tonight specifically talking about stressed investors and how this is playing out. And I'll do that shortly. So just bear that in mind. And just on financial stress, this is the aggregate view. So you can see that the Toowoomba 4350 is top of the list. And 58% of households there have cash flow problems. Then Liverpool, then Campbelltown, both in New South Wales, then Derrimut in Victoria, Cranbourne, Tarnet, centre of Melbourne, Westmead in New South Wales, Ipswich Queensland, Mount Druitt, Roxburgh Park, Ballarat, Southport, Wanneroo, and Narre Warren. And so these are some of the hotspots. And interestingly, the story here is that in some cases, property prices have risen in some of these areas, but nevertheless, people are still in some difficulty. And perhaps the rise in prices also explains why they've got bigger mortgages. Now, just quickly, let's just talk about, interesting. There's definitely a bug in the chat room. Maybe log out and log back in. Okay, I don't know what the problem is. I'm seeing some chats going on here, so everything's looking okay. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm certainly seeing chats here. So, Cookie, if you want to put more information in, feel free. From the scenarios perspective, it's worth highlighting, I think, that these scenarios are just ways of thinking about the future. They're not predictions. And I would get accused of making predictions. I'm not. I'm showing you the sensitivities. They run from today. And the scenarios are, in the best case scenario, the Goldilocks zone, where rates are at 4.35%, but then drop in February and drop further in the year. Inflation eases in line with RBA expectations. Wages rise faster. No recession. Australia migration remains above average. So that's sort of the best case. The base case, the soft landing, is we see rates staying a bit higher for 4.35 for longer. They will drop later. Inflation does fall, but then starts to pick up again. And that's some of those relief measures from the government disappear. And we actually see it staying above target in this scenario until 2026. And no recession in Australia. Migration down a bit. And then I've got the worst nightmare. Rise above 4.35% in 2025, stays high in 26, along with inflation. Unemployment rises, wages growth stalls due to recession here, and rates fall further. Migration falls below average. So all of those things are feasible. And just in terms of what that means, this is the overall view. So you can see here that in the best case scenario for Australian house prices, there is still an upside. Not a huge one, but maybe over the next 3 years, maybe 8%. The base case will be a fall, 12%. The worst case, which is probably unlikely now, would be a more significant fall. So we're somewhere between the sort of the best and base. And here we can see that the units are moving in a somewhat similar direction. Okay. Cookie Boy says, yes, I've refreshed and it seems to have cleared itself up. Okay, good. Well, maybe that's a local issue. YouTube's always a bit over the place, isn't it? But certainly everything's looking okay here. And certainly I'm seeing the streaming servicing working effectively. Okay. Now, I will just give you a couple of interesting variations. If you look at Western Australian scenario, so this is WA, and you can see here that there, best case still 16% over 3 years, so significant rises for houses. Base case, a bit of a fall, but not dramatic fall. Worst case, a very significant fall. And units following on. Compare that with Victoria, where even in the best case scenario, it's hard to see growth from this point forward. The fall would be stronger in the base case and much stronger in the worst case. And, I have this for each of the scenarios. So there's the Tasmanian one. And you can see there that Tasmania doesn't have a very good path. Units pretty much following on. We can look at South Australia. There is more upside there in the base case. Base case, a bit of a fall. We look at Queensland, again, significant growth, 13.6% for houses over 3 years ahead from this point. Base case, a bit of a fall, units following on. And New South Wales, bit of a rise, not quite so strong, maybe 7 or 8% over 3 years, best case, bit of a fall, more significant fall, and again, units somewhat similar. And the ACT, small rise, but very small, best case, base case, bit of a fall. And I think the ACT is particularly prone, of course, to changing government policy. So it depends on what's going to happen there as well. And just to complete the picture, there's the NT story. So again, because of the very small numbers, more volatile prices and risks to the upside and downside, depending on your scenario. So Let me now take the conversation forward, and I just want to touch on this one more time, because one of the interesting things here is looking at it on a segmented basis, and I can also look at these price trajectories on a scenario basis by segment. And just here's one example, just to give you a bit of a flavor. The wealthy seniors price scenario, this is people with property. Their best case scenario is a rise of about 10% over 3 years, but that's only the best case scenario. In the base case, a fall, and the worst case, a more significant fall. And this is important because if you actually have the view that prices are going to slide and you're holding on significant equity in your property at the moment, and you're in that later stage in life, then down trading becomes a very important question. Do I down trade? Do I actually go somewhere smaller and release equity before prices fall? If, on the other hand, you think that rates are going to get cut and prices are going to continue to rise, then you may have a different story. And that's the dilemma, of course, for many people at the moment, trying to figure out which of these scenarios is right, because it's going to actually determine quite a lot about what people choose to do. And that's one of the dilemmas, of course. That's something we can discuss into one-to-one conversations based about a particular scenario. So these scenarios are pretty important in terms of trying to weigh it up. So you need to sort of form a view as to which you think is most likely, and then form a strategy, I guess, around that. Now, if I compare that with the young person's price scenario, so this is young growing families, it's pretty interesting. So growth in this segment over the next 3 years, even in the best case scenario, is pretty limited, maybe 2 or 3%. Whereas there's a more significant fall in the base case and very significant fall in the worst case, units following on as well. So if you were thinking of buying and you're a young growing family, then posing the question, what if we don't get any price growth over the next 2 or 3 years, is a very important question. Now, that's not necessarily a terminal question. You still might decide to buy, but you certainly shouldn't be thinking of buying, if you're in this category, based on the aspiration of significant capital appreciation over the next 2 or 3 years, because I'm not sure we're going to see that. And that's taking me quite nicely into the segue that I want to touch on now, because I want to move on to this discussion specifically about the question of investment properties and what's going on. And to do that, I want to take a particular case study, because sometimes generic conversations don't necessarily help. So I want to take North Ryde units just as an interesting case study for this. And this first slide here shows you the median value between April 2015 and October 2024. And you can see here that the median value back in April 2015 was about $775,000. And it went up and up and up. It reached a peak in April 2016 and another peak in April 2018. And that was above $1 million. This is units in the same area, okay? And then it dropped away significantly and wobbled around and continues to wobble around, up and down, up and down, up and down. And at the moment, looking at the recent trend, there was a drop in around April 23, and it was back below where it was in April 2000 and 2015. Small rise, but now sliding again, and we're under 800,000. So if you were buying in this period here, you are sitting in capital loss now. And quite a lot of people did, because a lot of this was significant. And interestingly, Melanie just made the point, done deliberately. Wonder whether there was deliberate planning here locally as well. I don't know. There was huge planning, huge building, huge investment in these areas. Lots of new high-rise being built. A lot of people buying off the plan. A lot of investors overseas. Now, the interesting question then is, so what has that done to rental yields? And this is the rental yield for units in this area over that period. Now, the rental yield is a really important concept, right? And this, of course, is the gross rental yield as reported in all the portals. And it's the difference between the price of the property and the revenue you get from your rental, assuming it was fully rented. And back in April 15, it was 4.2%. And as those prices rose, it dropped down to about 3.2%, moved up a bit, dropped back down a bit, and is now up to 4.6. And the reason it's 4.6 is because property prices have come back. But it's a bit of an illusion, right? Because if you actually bought in these points here, you're sitting on capital loss. And I've had a number of conversations with people in this area who are sitting on capital loss and whose net rental yield, which is different from the gross rental yield, is underwater. So whilst the theoretical gross rental yield is a positive number, when you actually look at it in detail, it's a different story. And here is the information that I have. So this is actually my analysis of this particular postcode. And you can see here that there's 11,000 households there. You've got 48% in the rental sector, so that's quite a big rental sector. You've got 88% of them in rental stress, and you've got 37% of investors who are stressed. And you can see there that 54% of units. So this is a very significant factor. But here's the killer. Gross investment yield, if you aggregate it out, and this is across houses as well as units being slightly better than houses generally, net investment yield is minus 0.9%. So people are losing money on a cash flow basis. And that's quite interesting, right? So what that means is investors are struggling here, often sitting on capital losses and often losing money on a cash flow basis. No wonder then that people are actually thinking potentially about putting their properties on the market. And one of the trends we are seeing at the moment is quite a lot of listings rising. The fact that that's rising is quite significant. And the story, of course, is potential more pressure on house prices as listings rise. And they are still building additional new property in and around the area. So the supplies continue to grow, but the capital appreciation just isn't there. And that gives you a sort of a bit of a flavor of the dilemma that investors are facing at the moment. And I think this is a really important conversation to have, because the story here is, of course, that when you start delving into some of these things, you start realizing that there's a very different story to the one that is portrayed in the portals, or indeed portrayed in the mainstream media. Now, to take the conversation forward, what I want to do is I want to flick over and just look at some of my heat maps, because, of course, the heat maps are quite an interesting way of showing you at a postcode level what's actually going on. And so to do that, I'm going to start with just my standard mortgage stress one, but then I'm going to show you some heat maps specifically relating to investment property, because I want to make a bit of focus on investment property here today. So here is the overall story for mortgage stress data. And I've started with Sydney, of course, and I've got the count here. So this is effectively in blue, low counts, and in the oranges and reds, the high count. And you can see here that the centre of Sydney is looking pretty low, although there are some counts there, that are worth noting. But as we pull out, we start to see some yellows coming through, like Bondi, for example, Randwick, Ashfield, Neutral Bay, Wollstonecraft. And as we pull out further, we can see Parramatta Way, Bankston, Northern Beaches. And then we see the darker colours coming in. So this is, of course, the Western Sydney problem, with high counts of people like in Liverpool, 2170. And we pull out further, Camden, up towards Blacktown. And so you can see here that on a count basis, Western Sydney is where a lot of the issues are relative to the eastern suburbs. Now, if we then drop across to Melbourne and do a similar thing, you can see here that in and around the centre of Melbourne, there's some yellow. South Bank's not looking too bad. Carlton North not looking too bad. Canterbury's not looking too bad. But as we pull out, we can see there that some of the other areas like Point Cook are showing higher levels of mortgage stress. These are counts again, of course. 3064, 3806, 3805, down towards Frankston and Casey, 3977. And indeed Ballarat also popping out there. So again, you can see the patchwork quilt in terms of the pressure on some areas. And we can do the same in other areas. If we go across, for example, to Brisbane, Brisbane's looking a little more positive because prices have not, relatively speaking, been so high, although that's changing now. But even there, if you look at Camp Hill, 4152, you can see some orangey colours coming in. Overall towards Ipswich, the population density is a bit lower in a lot of areas, so that's one of the reasons why the counts might be a little lower. But you can see again the same sort of distribution. And if you go down towards the Gold Coast, again in yellows, so middle of the road stress, but significant. Ipswich does stand out as a very significant hotspot, of course, and that showed in the earlier analysis that we did. If we then go across to Perth, it's Western Australian postcodes, of course, and in and around Perth, well, there's a lot of blue, but there are also like Churchlands and Woodlands, 6018, that's a hotspot. And as we pull out, again, we are seeing some hotspots, particularly up north, around Wanneroo, and also south, 6112. So you can see there that there's quite a lot of difference. And this band to the south, which goes on down the coast towards Rockingham and up towards the north, a lot of high density, a lot of high new builds and highly mortgaged people. So that's the sort of the story with regard to the mortgage stress story. Now, let me open another chart here, because what I want to do now is to look at the investor stress. So doing the same modeling, but now looking at investor stress. Remember, what we're doing here is we're looking at properties in areas where the investment property is effectively containing people who are stressed. So just to be clear, it's where the property is, not where the investor is. And you can see here that we go from the blues through the yellows up to the reds. And in and around Sydney, you can see that there are a few hotspots. And in fact, those hotspots like Lane Cove really hots up there. So a lot of people in that area. Again, we're looking at the counts. So this shows you the density. So a lot of people with property investment in that area. Property investment in Parramatta, Maze Hill, sorry. Compare that with Strathfield and St Peters and Kingsgrove, Regent's Park, where the levels of stress are much lower. So it shows you that this is actually quite an important thing to understand, that in different areas, the stressed investor story is quite different. And as we pull out further, we can actually see that some of the areas like Campbelltown and even Blacktown, a bit different. Campbelltown in particular, a lot of mortgage stress, but the rental stress not quite so serious. So that's quite an interesting observation. If we then were to do the similar story by looking at Melbourne, centre of Melbourne, very strong red there. No surprise from what we said earlier on. As we pull out, you can see there that the stressed investor story is quite widely spread. And St Kilda is another hotspot, 3182. And as we pull out further, we can see that there are areas in and around where effectively the rental stress story is quite significant. Again, I want to highlight that the rental stress story and the mortgage stress story doesn't necessarily map onto each other very well. Now, if we go across to Perth, it gets quite interesting here, because guess what? We are seeing more levels of investor stress. 6010 around Mount Claremont, for example. And as we pull out, we can see that to the north and to the south, a few issues too. Around 6163 in particular is a bit of a hotspot. As we go down south, Rockingham, and up to the north towards Ronaroo. So once again, the story of investor stress is quite interesting. And I want to make the point that some of these investors, of course, are more willing to leave rather than to stay if, in fact, the investment is not now performing. And so the question of capital appreciation is quite important to understand. If capital appreciation continues to rise in the West, people may be able to wear the cash flow loss. But if capital appreciation starts to ease back, then that changes the story. Finally, if we just drop up to the Brisbane area, you can see here that in Fortitude Valley, for example, in South Brisbane, Highgate Hill, and West End, again, quite high levels of investor stress. So there are a number of property investors in and around Brisbane who are beginning to find it quite difficult to make sense of what's going on at the moment. And again, whilst property prices continue to rise, you might hold on. But if indeed property begins to turn, and there are some reports that in some areas of Brisbane we are seeing prices beginning to ease back, then maybe, just maybe, that will put the incentive in place and people will actually begin to think about selling. So that's sort of the first angle to consider here. Now, there's another way of looking at this information, and what I want to do is to load up another way of looking at it. Because we can look at, of course, this one here. This might be quite interesting. Let's put up the percentage of those properties with a gross investment yield. So this is now the gross investment yield. Gross investment yield, remember that's the property price versus the theoretical rental that's generated from the property. And we can see that coming up here. So this is the gross investment yield started in Sydney. And you can see here the codes go from 2.5% up to 5.1%, with red being the highest return. And in the middle of Sydney, you're getting a typical gross investment yield of between 3 and 4. As we pull out, we can see there that those investment yields are relatively consistent, falling a little bit in the outer suburban areas down towards Dulwich Hill and Belfield. Strathfield, again, a bit of a hotspot with a more lower investment yield. And you can see there that pretty much across the Greater Sydney area, the typical investment yield is in the mid-3s, some variations. Now, if we compare that with Melbourne, you can see here that the yellows are a bit sharper. And interestingly, again, remember that orange here means higher. You can see here that as we go out, we're into the 3s and the low 3s, or the 2s. And look at 3026, 3083 as an example. So remember, these are gross investment yields. So this is actually not taking account of the cost of the property. This is just what you're actually achieving relative to the price of the property. And you would expect this to be somewhat better now because property prices in Melbourne have slid quite a lot. And because it's a ratio, the difference between rentals, which are going up, and property prices, which are going down, you would expect these to be better, but they're not. They're still pretty limited. Now, what I can also do is now switch from the gross investment to the net investment yield. And remember, the net investment yield is the difference between the costs that you're having to pay to continue to maintain the property. So that's the rental payments, management fees, maintenance, rates, or if you pay those, all those things, and the actual real income you're getting in. So if you have a vacant property, of course, you don't get any income in, so that's not included. And here you can see that the story is very different. So now I've got my dark reds in negative, so negative 1.4% and below, The blues are 0.5% and above. So this is now the real cash flow return. And I want to highlight that most of these areas in and around Sydney, other than perhaps Lane Cove, property investors are looking, if they do the math, at almost no returns until you get out to places like Summerhill, Annandale, Croydon, Strathfield, where you're making just small returns between 0 and 0.5% in cash flow terms. So that's the real shocking story of property investment. And it's not one that people want to talk about. It's not one that the portals want to report on. But for me, it's a very important one. Now, there are places like 2168 where the returns are a bit higher. St Leonard's, Nuremberg as well. So, there are a few hotspots, but this is quite an interesting story. And what I find fascinating here, you can go further out like Camden, not doing too badly. But if you then go out towards the Liverpools and those areas, you can see there that things are not much better. So there are a lot of investors who are, from a cash flow perspective, not doing that well at the moment. And remember that rental growth is now rising, but more slowly. And the expectation is it will continue to rise even more slowly ahead. And property prices may not be growing as fast. So, yeah, interesting question. Now, what happens in Melbourne? Again, if you look at Melbourne, in the centre of Melbourne, the story is that we are looking at mostly negative returns in cash flow basis. There are a few, just a few, where in fact people are seeing positive returns, but you've got to look hard for them. There's one there, 3133. We've also got a few others if you zoom out, but you can see there that across the Melbourne area, the bulk of property investors are actually underwater from a cash flow perspective. Some of them don't know it because they don't do the calculation, but if they did do it, they would see it. Go to Brisbane, bit different story. Here, returns are higher. So if you look at the centre of Brisbane, above 0.5%. And as we pull out, you can see there that there's quite a lot of variation. There are some areas where it's warmer, other areas where it's in negative territory. Kedron 4031, for example, and Wakerley 4154. So it's quite fascinating to see how this plays out. So it's worth highlighting that if you're thinking about investment property, then you need to go granular and understand all the dynamics in these areas because there are big differences. Now, if we go to Perth, you can see there that in the centre of Perth, big variation. Northbridge is down, whereas postcode here, 6004 East Perth, is quite strong. West Leederville is quite strong. It varies quite considerably. And we pull out Rivervale, relatively weak. Stirling, Osborne Park, 6017. And as we go down towards the south, below Fremantle, you'll see that there's quite a lot down towards Serpentine. And even in the Rockingham area, well, the good news is that some of those in and around Rockingham are perhaps somewhere between 0 and positive 0.5%. Go down a bit further, then the returns are a bit better. And that's quite often because a lot of the property there is not that well maintained. So there's a difference between perhaps what you should be paying and what you actually are paying. So the point I want to make about all of this is that when you actually look at investment property, the story is really quite different from the one that perhaps people want to see. And that's one of the reasons why we are seeing more property investors beginning to think about perhaps selling up and selling out, which is why listings are up. And as I discussed with Edwin yesterday, the listings are actually quite a lot higher than perhaps they were earlier on. So that's, I think, a very important little thing to understand. Now, I was just looking back at the chat there, and Bossman said, whoops, missed. Try that one. Yeah, my rent's got another $50, I should say, a week. Yeah, unfortunately, quite a few people are still seeing their rents rising. The rate of rise is a little bit lower, but Tarek and I discussed this at the end of last week. There's actually still significant momentum in terms of rentals, and of course high demand, not least because of the high migration. So I'm not sure that the full story. Now, of course, the Commonwealth Rent Assistance is also another of the government support mechanisms, and that has enabled the rental numbers to be a little bit below what they would have been. So the growth was sort of 6 something rather than 7 something. So that's also another factor. That, of course, feeds into the CPI. The CPI is a little bit lower than it would otherwise be because of the fact the government's been throwing taxpayer money at it again. And that, of course, is part of the story. Okay. Now, gosh, Bossman's followed up with another post, which is quite concerning. Thank you, Bossman. 50.25% increase over 4 years. Yep. That's actually not atypical. So in some cases, we've seen rentals rising by 20% over 12 months. And some people are able to negotiate 2 or 3 years, and some people less so. And of course, what happens quite often is that the landlord then decides to sell the property rather than re-rent it, or indeed kick somebody out and then bring somebody else back in, which is a bit of a problem. Now, it's interesting because Jack says, isn't capital loss the reason for rental properties so you can claim rates deductions? Well, of course, you can offset a lot of these losses. And my point there is, if you think that property prices are going to continue to rise from an investment perspective, then you might do that because, of course, the story is that still property is appreciating in value. But as I showed you from my scenarios, that isn't necessarily true. And as I showed you from North Ryde, there, property investors were buying when prices were rising and then they fell back. And that's one reason why, whilst the yields theoretically are reported quite positive, in fact, in reality, many investors there are losing their shirts and thinking of selling. So it's very important to sort of step back and think about the fundamentals as well as just the tax adjustment. And look, I think Cole is right. I do think that the negative gearing and all those other tax offsets that you can get are part of the story here, and property investors are actually still piling in. But if you do the math and actually do the calculation relative to 4 to 5% in bonds or term deposits with perhaps lower risk, then you've got to ask the question, is property investment the deal that it's portrayed to be? And I do find it fascinating that the government has outsourced effectively to the private sector the provision of rental property. Years ago, the government had a bigger stock. Now, of course, it's being pushed into the private sector through mum and dad investors, some of whom are losing their shirt in the process, and in now indeed build to rent. And that's another factor, of course. They're getting tax breaks potentially to build to rent. Big players are coming in to try and actually help with supply. But the question is it really helping? And I've had the theory for some time, beginning to see some of the data to prove it, that those build to rent properties are actually coming on the market, if and when they're built, at a higher price point, which means that the investor may be getting a return, but the prospective renter is having to pay more just to be able to get by. So to my mind, it's a bit of a conundrum here, and it's a conundrum that I think is worth thinking about in a bit more detail. Okay, so I think that's a good place to just check back through the chat and just see what people were talking about. James says ANZ cutting rates, getting ahead of the curve. We're seeing quite a lot of that. So at the moment, banks are actually trying to attract new people in. There's a big difference between, of course, those who've already got a mortgage and trying to negotiate with their existing bank and refinancing to another bank. If you go to another bank, they'll probably offer you a better deal. That's churning, of course, churning costs, and the banks, of course, want to have their share. Overall growth in lending, as I showed earlier on, is still pretty strong, though. So, banks are doing quite well. And Wednesday said, good evening, good evening. Thanks for dropping in. Great to see you. Okay. What else have we got? Either way, they want your house. Yeah, this is an unfortunate thing, of course. So if you're a mortgage holder, the average mortgage is now increased in duration It's around 35%, 35 years, I should say, for new ones now. It used to be 25 years. And that means you're paying a lot longer. Also, the average age of a first-time buyer is now 10 years older than it used to be. So that means a lot more people are holding a mortgage a lot longer a period of time and going into retirement, which is a problem because, of course, as you go into retirement, income tends to degrade. And that means that, potentially you're going to be in a more difficult position through retirement and ultimately have to pay off the mortgage or sell the property to cash out. I have to tell you, there was somebody telling me the other day they had a conversation with their bank and they were talking about having difficulty paying, and they suggested that they are going to reach for help from hardship funds, not from the bank, but from the local authority, which I thought was quite interesting. Banks trying to sort of shift the problem. So that's a real issue. If you're in the rental sector and you never actually own a property, as I said at the start, a lot of people moving into older age now are still renting. They're still very much at the market's behest. And as we see strong migration continuing to still push in, as we see rent still rising, as people still are holding those rental properties into older age, then that's going to put more pressure on their finances into their retirement. And the winners are, of course, the big investment firms. The winners are the banks. I'm doubting that some property investors feel winners at the moment, but some do. Some people are still buying in and buying more property, hoovering up perhaps distressed properties. There are more distressed properties coming at the moment, but it's definitely more complex than many people think. And Jump says that best investment at the moment is gold and silver. Yeah, well, it's certainly holding value relative to the devaluation of the dollar, of course. And as I've discussed several times, the truth is that in a way, property prices rising is more a function of the reduced value of the dollar than it is actually anything else. And this sort of spurious idea that we are magically really wealthy now because of this massive increase in the value of property because of the devaluation of the dollar and because of the fact that your dollar buys you less now than it used to is the true story. But hey, don't let truth get in the way of a good story, eh? Okay, let's have a look. What else have we got in the chat? Anything else I need to cover off? No. Okay, I think, whoops, what's happened here? My chat's just frozen. Yeah, YouTube's definitely not quite as friendly as it is sometimes today. I'm not quite sure why that is. So have a little bit of a dig around. There we go. Yeah. Just reading the chat here. Drew says the winners are the politicians. Well, of course, they've got a higher proportion of investment properties per capita relative to ordinary people. And maybe they do want to protect their own. Who knows? I can remember one politician who recently bought on the mid-coast there, Central Coast, and is now renting out and being able to offset the losses as an investment property. Nice if you can get it. Oh, and nice new road just down the road as well. Rate cut. Martin, your opinion, Drew says. Well, I think there's a quite significant chance the RBA will cut next week, but they shouldn't cut because the underlying data doesn't support it. The fact is that inflation is not as benign as the headline numbers would suggest, not least, of course, because of all this government intervention around the rates. And as a result of that, I think that it's quite likely that they will cut and probably cut later in the year, but then they'll see that inflation starts to pick up again. Jobs are really strong. The retail numbers were really strong. The momentum in the economy is quite weak, but maybe beginning to turn in some regards. Confidence may be turning up a little bit. Business confidence looks to be a little bit stronger. So, yeah, I think the RBA just needs to be quite careful. Remember, of course, the RBA is meeting for the last time in its current format. The next meeting will be with a new board, which will include a couple of new members. Now, those new members will have been sort of funneled in thanks to government influence. Whether they will change the tenor of the board and their decision-making, we'll see. Whether the Reserve Bank wants to put a stake in the ground this time to hold firm ahead of the next meeting, I don't know. But they are under huge political pressure, not least, of course, because the government wants to go to the election with rate cuts, with the claim that they're managing the economy and helping people and all those things. I just remind everybody that the deficit will rise. The support that's being thrown across the economy at the moment to keep CPI down is going to cost. And the costs of borrowing, of course, is still a lot higher than it used to be. And even if rates come down a bit, costs will still be quite high. Another factor, of course, to bear in mind here is that, as I said earlier on, just to re-emphasize, if the RBA does cut the cash rate, there isn't a one-to-one relationship between that and the mortgage rate. So they may or may not take the mortgage rate down. They might do it selectively. The banks might target new customers rather than existing customers. And certainly the journey down from higher rates is always lower than the step up. When rates are risen, guess what? Banks put their mortgage rate up immediately. When rates are cut, they're a little bit less generous. And the other point to make, of course, in all of this is that savers will also lose out. Savers are already losing. The saving rate has come back a little bit and will continue to drop. And that means that some households with assets and savings are going to be under pressure too. So there's a swings and roundabout story here, which is not often reported in the media. Okay. Drew makes an interesting point. How do you get it sustained? Price is the same? Well, it's an interesting question. Prices are over. If you compare prices today with prices 20 years ago, say, the debt to income ratio is much higher now. So typically it's now 5, 6, 7 times, maybe 8 times. It used to be 3 times. If you look at that in terms of disposable income, what that means is that the disposable income is much lower than it was. And in fact, just to give you a bit of a flavor of that, if we were to look at some of the data from my surveys, and we'll just maybe just cut across this and have a look at this to show you what I mean. So here is the data from my surveys here for postcode 2500. It's one that I look at quite often for all sorts of reasons, not least because I know it really well, of course. And this particular one is quite fascinating insofar that if you look at the data, you can see here that the disposable monthly income is around $6,000. The average amount going on the mortgage in this postcode, this is the postcode around Wollongong, is 40.9%. And the average proportion on a rent is 33%. Now, of course, it used to be people would say, well, if you're spending more than 30%, then you've got a stress problem. Well, these are at 40%. And in this particular postcode, I think about 35% of households are in difficulty. The rental stress is quite high. And that's putting some downward pressure. So the price scenarios here is probably a bit lower. So this is quite important to understand, this disposable monthly income story. And I do think disposable monthly income is really important to understand, because the other factor that people need to bear in mind is that the tax take from government is a lot higher than it used to be. So it's pretty much as high. Now, we did have some tax cuts, of course, a little while ago, but the tax take is still going up. We still have bracket creep, and we'll have bracket creep in the years ahead. And that tax take means that the available disposable income that people have to pay for a mortgage and everything else continues to go down. And it's the tax take that I think is the untold story here. I don't think that we can afford bigger deficits. Okay, our deficit isn't as big as the US or the UK. And in the UK, it's 100% of GDP. Ours is lower here in Australia. But the fact is that this is a real factor for people. And so the disposable monthly income is an angle I think that's worth looking at. And, if we were to look at other postcodes, this is one that's quite interesting. If you look at this one in Canberra, you can see here that in Canberra, the disposable monthly income is quite a lot lower. So this one, with 40% of households in mortgage stress, 32% is going on the mortgage disposable monthly. But look at the disposable monthly income, it's a lot higher, 10,000. And if you look at the ATO data, you can see here that the household census data says 156,000 in this postcode, 139,000 from the individual ATO data as well. So here you've got more income to start with. Therefore, the absolute share of disposable monthly income is a bit lower, but we've still got stress going on. And so this is an important thing to understand. And the point I want to come back to is that disposable monthly income and stress is directly linked to amount of income coming in and the tax being paid and all those things. So this is a factor that I think is really, really important. Well, I think we're pretty much done then on tonight's show. So we've covered what I wanted to cover, which was the overall story with mortgage stress and rental stress, and particularly investor stress. We also covered the issue of what's going on with regard to gross and net investment yield and the fact that some investors are really beginning to struggle now. And we also touched on the question of the broader economy and whether the RBA will cut. So those are the things I wanted to cover off. Thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to the next conversation, which will be next Tuesday live. That'll be with Leith Van Onselen from, of course, Macro Business and from Nucleus Wealth. And Leith and I will be talking the evening that the RBA comes out with its decision. So that'll be quite an interesting conversation. Leith, of course, believes that the RBA will cut. And he could well be right. We'll see about that. I'll be making some more shows over the next few days, of course, recorded. And keep that going. I will be making a longer show on the recent announcement from the Treasurer relating specifically to the question of Australia Post, etc., etc. And I want to say thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. Jason, thank you very much for Super Chat. Really appreciate it. And as you say there, please like and share this post. It really helps to get the message out. And we've had quite a lot of success in recent times in terms of subscriber growth. So that's great. Please like and share and check out our next shows. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the next live stream next week. And also, of course, in the meantime, on the recorded shows. And just to show you that the dogs are still here, they were quite quiet most of the time, although Luna seems to have moved slightly. I don't know quite how that happened. So there you go, there's Luna. Luna and Meteor now need their lunch and then another walk. So that's the next thing on my list today. Thanks very much. Have a really good evening and keep well. And I look forward to catching up on the next show. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Take care.